My name is Daniel Erickson, and what I'm about to tell you happened during the winter of 2022. I had retreated to a cabin my grandfather left me deep in the Superior National Forest, nearly 40 miles from the nearest town. I was running from everything, a divorce that had drained my soul, a job that felt like slow suicide, and a world that seemed to have forgotten what silence meant. The cabin was primitive, heated by wood, powered by a small generator, and surrounded by nothing but ancient pines, and the kind of quiet that makes city dwellers panic. I had planned to stay through winter, to find some version of myself that wasn't broken. The cabin sat on the edge of boundary waters, where the trees grew so thick that noon felt like dusk, and the cold was so pure it burned your lungs clean. My grandfather had been a trapper, and the place still held his spirit. Practical, hardy, unforgiving. Perfect for a man trying to forget how to be weak. The first month passed in a rhythm I'd forgotten existed. I chopped wood until my shoulders ached, hauled water from the well until my back screamed, and read by candlelight until my eyes burned. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of things I'd forgotten to notice. The whisper of snow falling through branches, the distant call of wolves, the crack of trees splitting in the cold. I was healing slowly like a bone that had been broken for so long I'd forgotten it was supposed to be whole. But by December, the winter turned vicious. The thermometer dropped to 30 below, and snow fell in blankets so thick I couldn't see the tree line from my window. The generator failed twice, leaving me huddled around the wood stove, burning furniture when the split logs ran low. I was rationing food, making trips to my truck increasingly dangerous as the drifts grew higher than my waist. The isolation that had felt like medicine began to feel like a slow burial. It was during the third week of this brutal stretch that I first saw the tracks. I had ventured out to check my snares, hoping against hope that something had been foolish enough to get caught in weather that was killing everything else. The snow crunched under my snowshoes with a sound like breaking bones, and my breath came in clouds so thick they obscured my vision. That's when I saw them, footprints in the pristine snow that made my blood stop moving. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my boot, but wrong in a way that made my primitive brain scream warnings. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks extending beyond where toes should end. They followed a perfectly straight line toward my cabin, then circled it 3 times before disappearing into the tree line. Whatever had made them hadn't stumbled or wandered. It had moved with purpose, studying my home like a predator, learning the habits of prey. I stood there in the killing cold, staring at those tracks, while every instinct my grandfather had bred into our bloodline told me to run. But where could I run to? My truck was buried under 4 feet of snow. The roads were impassable, and the nearest neighbor was 15 miles away through terrain that would kill me long before I reached help. I was trapped with something that shouldn't exist, in a place where screaming would only echo back unanswered. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with my grandfather's 30-06 across my knees, watching the tree line for movement that never came. But I could feel eyes on me, patient and intelligent, studying me through the darkness. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak of the cabin settling sounded like footsteps on the porch. The wind howled through the pines with a voice that sounded almost human, almost hungry. Morning brought fresh snow and fresh tracks, closer this time, circling the cabin in a tighter spiral. Whatever was out there was getting bolder, or more desperate. I found myself checking the locks on doors that had never been locked, reinforcing windows with boards that would stop a raccoon, but nothing larger. The rational part of my mind insisted it was a bear, maybe a moose, anything explainable. But the animal part of my brain, the part that had kept humans alive for millennia, knew better. The second night I heard breathing, not my own ragged gasps, or the whisper of wind through trees, but deep, deliberate inhalations outside my bedroom window, the sound of something large drawing air across teeth that were too sharp, savoring scents that told stories I didn't want to understand. I lay frozen in my bed, holding my breath until my lungs burned, listening to that patient rhythm of predator patience. When dawn finally came, I found handprints pressed into the frost on the window glass, prints with fingers too long and joints that bent in directions human anatomy doesn't allow. By the fourth day, I was talking to myself just to break the silence, just to hear a human voice in all that wilderness. I told myself I was going crazy, that isolation and fear were making me see things that weren't there. But the tracks kept appearing, always fresh, always closer, and I was running out of food. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of hiding, instead of pretending the thing outside didn't exist, I decided to acknowledge it, to see what it wanted. I took the last of my jerky, a handful of dried fruit and some crackers, and I left them on the porch in a metal plate. It felt ridiculous, like leaving cookies for Santa, but desperation makes you try things that sanity would never allow. I retreated inside and watched through the window as snow began to fall again, covering my offering with a pristine white blanket. An hour after sunset the food was gone, not scattered by wind, not disturbed by squirrels or ravens, simply gone. The plate licked clean and placed neatly back where I'd left it. But beside the plate, pressed into the snow, was something that made my hands shake as I retrieved it the next morning. A piece of birch bark, folded carefully, with markings scratched into its surface. Not random scratches, but deliberate symbols that looked almost like primitive writing, like something trying to communicate across a gap so wide it might as well be between species. That night, I left more food. This time, I watched from the window as something emerged from the tree line just after midnight. What I saw defied everything I thought I knew about what was possible in this world. It was tall, impossibly tall, moving through the snow with a grace that seemed to defy physics. Its limbs were too long, its proportions wrong, in a way that hurt to look at directly. But it wasn't the mindless monster I'd expected. It approached the porch cautiously, almost respectfully, taking the food with movements that seemed grateful. When it looked toward the window where I stood, its eyes reflected the lamplight with an intelligence that was undeniably aware, undeniably thinking. A Wendigo. The word whispered itself through my mind like an ancestral memory, carrying with it stories my grandfather had told me as a child. Stories I'd dismissed as folklore, meant to keep children close to home. But looking at this creature, this impossible being that moved like winter itself, I understood that some stories are older than skepticism, older than the need to explain everything in terms that make rational sense. For the next week, our routine continued. I would leave food, always a little more than the night before, and it would take what I offered, always leaving something in return, pieces of bark with symbols, unusually shaped stones, once a perfect pine cone with every scale intact. Gifts, I realized. It was bringing me gifts. The symbols on the bark began to form patterns I almost recognized. Circles within circles, lines that intersected in ways that suggested meaning just beyond my understanding. I found myself sketching them during the day, turning them over in my mind like a puzzle I was desperate to solve. The creature was trying to tell me something, to bridge a gap between its world and mine that should have been impossible to cross. On the 10th night, it spoke. Not in words, not in any language I recognized, but in sounds that carried meaning the way wind carries scent. A low harmonic vocalization that seemed to come from deep within its chest, resonating through the cabin walls and into my bones. I found myself responding without conscious thought, humming back in tones that felt right, felt like the beginnings of understanding. From that moment, everything changed. The fear that had gripped me for weeks began to transform into something else. Curiosity, wonder, a growing sense that I was witnessing something that few humans had ever experienced. The Wendigo wasn't the monster of legend, the cannibal spirit that devoured human flesh and sanity. It was something far more complex, something that had learned to survive in a world that had forgotten its existence. Over the following nights, our communication deepened. Through sounds, gestures, and the strange symbolic language scratched into bark, I began to understand fragments of its story. It was old, ancient beyond my ability to comprehend. It had watched the forests change, had seen the ice sheets retreat and return, had witnessed the arrival of my ancestors, and learned to hide from the fear that followed them. But it was also alone. Impossibly, tragically alone. The last of its kind in a world that had moved beyond the need for creatures like it. It had survived by avoiding human contact, by becoming the shadow in the periphery, the movement just beyond clear sight. But survival and living, I began to understand, were not the same thing. The gifts it brought became more personal, more deliberate. Crystals from deep caves I would never find. Feathers from birds that migrated in patterns older than human memory, once a small carving made from what looked like mammoth ivory, something that shouldn't have existed in these forests for 10,000 years. Each gift was a piece of its world offered to mine, a bridge built from curiosity and something that might have been loneliness. I began leaving more than food. I left books, though I doubted it could read them. I left photographs of places I'd traveled, trying to show it a world beyond these forests. I left recordings of music on an old battery-powered player, watching from the window as it tilted its massive head toward the speakers, like a dog hearing a distant whistle. The strangest gift was its reaction to Mozart. I had left a classical compilation playing one evening, expecting nothing more than the usual polite acceptance of my offerings. Instead, I watched as the creature sat motionless in the snow for nearly an hour, its entire body focused on the music with an intensity that suggested deep recognition. When the recording ended, the silence felt different, charged with an emotion I couldn't name. The next morning, I found a piece of bark covered with symbols that looked almost like musical notation, flowing lines that curved and intersected in patterns that suggested rhythm, harmony, melody. It had been trying to give me back the music, to show me that it understood beauty in ways I'd never considered possible. That's when I realized what it really wanted. Not food, though it accepted what I offered. Not shelter, though it sometimes waited out the worst storms under the overhang of my porch. What it wanted was what every thinking being wants, what I'd been searching for when I fled to these mountains in the first place. It wanted to be known, to be seen not as a monster or a myth, but as a consciousness trying to connect across an impossible divide. It wanted to share the vast loneliness that came from being the last of anything, the weight of carrying entire worlds of knowledge and memory with no one to pass them on to. As January deepened into the most brutal cold I'd ever experienced, our evening meetings became the center of my existence. I would prepare offerings with the care of a priest preparing sacraments, choosing each item for its potential meaning, its ability to build the bridge between us, one exchange at a time. The creature, which I had begun thinking of as the Ancient One, would arrive with the patience of something that had measured time in centuries, not minutes. One night, during a blizzard that threatened to collapse my roof under the weight of snow, it didn't come. I waited by the window until dawn, watching snow pile against the glass, until the world outside disappeared entirely. When the storm finally passed 2 days later, I found the offering untouched, already buried under drifts that reached the eaves of the cabin. I snowshoed out into the forest, following our usual meeting paths, calling out in the harmonic tones we'd developed as our shared language, but the woods were empty, except for the echoes of my own voice bouncing back from the snow-laden trees. For 3 days, I searched every trail, every clearing where we'd shared our strange communion. The Ancient One had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. On the fourth night, I found the answer. A piece of bark larger than any before, covered with symbols more complex and detailed than anything it had previously created. As I traced the markings by candlelight, a story emerged, not in words, but in images that formed in my mind like memories that weren't my own. The Ancient One was dying, not from illness or injury, but from the simple weight of existing too long in a world that had changed beyond recognition. It had used the last of its strength to sustain our meetings, to experience one final connection before surrendering to the rest it had earned through millennia of solitary endurance. Our exchanges hadn't been about survival. They had been about saying goodbye. The symbols told me where to find it. A cave system 30 miles north, hidden in a ravine that maps didn't show and GPS couldn't locate. A place where its kind had rested for generations, where bones older than human civilization lay in careful arrangements that spoke of ritual, of reverence, of a species that understood death as part of a larger pattern. It took me 6 days to reach the caves, breaking trail through snow that sometimes swallowed me to my chest. I found the Ancient One in the deepest chamber, lying on a bed of pine boughs arranged with the precision of a cathedral altar. It was still breathing, but barely, each inhalation a struggle that echoed off the cave walls like the whisper of distant wind. When it saw me, its eyes, those impossible, intelligent eyes, filled with something that might have been gratitude. I sat beside it in the darkness, and for the last time we shared our wordless communication. It told me, in ways that bypassed language entirely, about the world it had known. Forests that stretched unbroken from ocean to ocean, skies so dark you could see the spiral arms of galaxies, the sound of its own kind calling across valleys that now lay under cities and highways. But it also told me about the gift our meetings had given it, the knowledge that consciousness could recognize consciousness across any divide, that intelligence could honor intelligence even when separated by evolution, culture, and species. In its final communications, I felt not sadness, but a deep sense of completion, of a story that had found its proper ending. The Ancient One died as dawn light filtered into the cave, its breathing simply stopping like a clock winding down. I sat with the body for hours, understanding that I was the only witness to the passing of something that had existed since before my species learned to speak. When I finally emerged from the caves, the world felt different, emptier, as if some essential weight had been lifted from it. I made my way back to the cabin in a daze, moving through landscape that looked the same but felt forever changed. The isolation that had driven me to the mountains was nothing compared to the isolation I now understood. The terrible loneliness of being the last of anything, of carrying knowledge that would die with you. Spring came early that year, and with it the need to return to a world I no longer fit into properly. I packed my grandfather's belongings, secured the cabin for another season of emptiness, and drove back towards civilization with a story I could never tell, evidence that would never convince anyone who hadn't lived it. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the air is sharp with the promise of snow, I return to those mountains. I leave offerings in the places where we met, not expecting them to be taken, but as a memorial to something that existed beyond the boundaries of what we think possible. And sometimes, just sometimes, I imagine I hear that harmonic call echoing through the trees, carrying with it the weight of ancient memories and the possibility that not everything ends when we think it does. The symbols the Ancient One left me remain untranslatable, but I've learned to read the emotion in them, the vast sadness and overwhelming gratitude that defined our brief connection. They remind me that intelligence takes forms we're only beginning to understand, that consciousness might be the universe's way of knowing itself, regardless of the shape it takes. I never found another Wendigo in those forests, and I suspect I never will. But the memory of our communion has changed how I see the world, how I understand my place in the vast web of existence that connects every thinking thing. In a world that's increasingly connected, but increasingly lonely, I carry with me the knowledge that true communication transcends species, language, even the basic assumptions we make about what life can be. The Ancient One taught me that some hungers can't be satisfied with food, that some needs go deeper than survival, that the most powerful force in the universe might simply be the desire to be understood. In feeding it during those harsh winter nights, I learned that I was feeding something in myself as well, the part that needed to believe that consciousness in all its forms deserves recognition, respect, and the simple dignity of being seen. Sometimes I wonder if there are others out there, remnants of older worlds surviving in the spaces we haven't yet claimed or destroyed. Part of me hopes there are, and part of me hopes they've learned to hide better than my Ancient One did, because this world has forgotten how to make room for things it doesn't understand, and the loneliness of being the last of anything is a burden no consciousness should have to bear. But in those brief weeks when winter held us both captive in the same small corner of existence, something passed between us that transcended every boundary I thought was absolute. A creature of legend and a broken man finding common ground in the simple act of acknowledgement, in the radical idea that every thinking being deserves to be seen, to be known, to matter to someone else before the darkness finally claims them. That's what the Ancient One really wanted, I understand now. Not food for its body, but food for the deeper hunger that comes with consciousness, the need to know that your existence has been witnessed, that your story has been heard, that the vast loneliness of thinking and feeling in an indifferent universe can be broken even briefly by the simple miracle of recognition. And in those final moments in the cave, watching the last light fade from eyes that had seen the birth and death of forests, I realized that it had given me the same gift. For the first time since my world had fallen apart, I felt truly seen, truly known, not as the failure I thought I'd become, but as a consciousness worthy of respect, worthy of the effort required to reach across an impossible divide. The marks on my soul from that winter are deeper than the scars the cold left on my hands. They remind me daily that the universe is stranger, more beautiful, and more connected than our limited perspective usually allows us to see. They whisper to me in moments of despair that somewhere, in forms we can't imagine, consciousness continues its ancient work of reaching toward consciousness, building bridges across the vast emptiness that separates every thinking thing. In the end, feeding the Wendigo during those harsh winter months taught me that the most radical act in an increasingly disconnected world is simply to see another being, any being, as worthy of acknowledgement, respect, and the basic dignity of being known. The Ancient One may be gone, but the lesson remains, as permanent as the symbols scratched into bark, as enduring as the memory of harmonic calls echoing through snow-laden trees. And on the darkest nights, when the weight of human loneliness threatens to crush what's left of my faith in connection, I remember the gift of those winter meetings, the knowledge that consciousness recognizes consciousness, that intelligence honors intelligence, and that the universe's deepest magic might simply be its capacity to allow separate beings to truly see each other, if only for a moment, before the darkness claims us all. The years that followed blurred together like seasons viewed from a moving train. I returned to the world of deadlines and traffic lights, of small talk and social media, of all the noise that humans create to fill the silence they fear. But I carried within me something that couldn't be explained in job interviews or therapy sessions, the memory of communion with something ancient and impossible. I never spoke of what happened in those mountains. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I became a custodian of memory, a keeper of secrets that belong to a world older and stranger than the one we've built over its bones. I donated to wildlife preservation groups, volunteered at nature centers, and found small ways to honor the bridge that had been built between species in the depth of a Minnesota winter. My grandfather's cabin became a pilgrimage site for me, though I visited less frequently as arthritis settled into joints that remembered too many winters spent chopping wood and hauling water. Each return felt like visiting a cathedral, where miracles had once occurred, where the impossible had briefly become possible through the simple act of acknowledgement and respect. The last time I made the journey, I was 73 years old, moving slowly through forests that had grown wilder in my absence. The cabin stood empty but intact, weathered but enduring, much like the memories it housed. I left one final offering on the porch, where our communion had begun. Not food this time, but a letter written on bark I'd carefully prepared, using symbols I'd spent decades learning to inscribe properly. The letter contained everything I'd never been able to say to another human being: gratitude for being seen, appreciation for the bridge we'd built across impossible differences, and a promise that the story would live on, even when I no longer could. I signed it with the harmonic notation the Ancient One had taught me, scratched into bark with the same careful precision it had once used to speak across the divide between our worlds. That night, I dreamed of vast forests under starlight, older than human memory, of a voice calling across valleys that echoed with the wisdom of deep time. When I woke, the letter was gone, replaced by a single perfect pine cone with every scale intact. The same gift the Ancient One had left me decades before, somehow preserved against all logic and time. I understood then that some connections transcend the boundaries of life and death, that consciousness leaves echoes in places where it once touched other consciousness with genuine recognition. The Ancient One was gone, but the bridge we'd built remained, waiting for others brave enough to cross it, patient enough to learn its language, open enough to see intelligence in forms they'd never imagined possible. I write these words now in my final winter, knowing they'll be my last testimony to something the world needs to remember. We live in an age that has forgotten how to make room for mystery, how to honor intelligence that doesn't mirror our own, how to build bridges instead of walls between different forms of consciousness. But somewhere in the deep places of the world, in the spaces we haven't yet claimed or destroyed, other ancient intelligences wait with the patience of stone and the wisdom of deep time. They watch us struggle with our loneliness, our disconnection, our endless hunger for meaning in a universe that seems indifferent to our needs. The lesson of the Wendigo isn't about monsters or myths. It's about recognition, about the radical act of seeing consciousness wherever it manifests, about the bridges that can be built between any two beings willing to acknowledge each other's fundamental dignity. In a world growing ever more divided, ever more isolated despite our technological connections, this lesson has never been more vital. I leave this story as my final gift to a species that has forgotten how to listen to voices that don't sound like their own. May you find the courage to feed whatever ancient intelligences still wander the margins of our world. May you build bridges across the vast loneliness that separates every thinking being. And may you remember, in your own hours of deepest isolation, that consciousness calls to consciousness across every divide, speaking languages older than words, building connections stronger than fear. The Ancient One is gone, but the echo of our communion remains, waiting in the silence between snowflakes, in the space between heartbeats, in the moment of recognition when one conscious being truly sees another. Listen for it. You might be surprised by what calls back.